Welcome to Aircrew Interview. I'm Mike, and this episode is with Dim Jones. Dim chats about flying the RAF Lightning, Phantom and Jaguar, but the main focus of the interview is his US Air Force exchange tour flying the F-16 Fighting Falcon. So if you like what we do here, head over to patreon.com/aircrew interview to help us out for as little as $1 per month. Enjoy. So Dim, when did you first become interested in aviation?
Well, my father was in the Air Force and really never thought of anything else.
So what year did you join the RAF?
66, March 66 I went to Cromwell and was there till 68.
Could you tell us some about the aircraft you flew?
What during training?
Stage, yeah.
Elementary flying training then, as such, didn't exist. We went straight to basic training on the Jet Provost. Some people had some experience on flying scholarships. I had a private pilot's license through the RAF. Other people had flown a bit on Chipmunks, but essentially we all started off on the JP3 and 4.
Yeah. You also flew the NAT. Could you tell us what this was like to fly?
Rocket-powered roller skate, really. I think we all sat outside the ground school on the first day at Valley and looked at these things buzzing around the circuit and thought, there is no way we can fly at that speed. But it was a wonderful aeroplane, very small, as you know, strap it on rather than climb into it. But it was the first aeroplane really that had fast jet performance that we'd flown.
So how long did you spend on the NAT?
About 6 months on the course, yeah.
And then you went on to the Hunter. Could you tell us how this happened?
At the time, there was a backlog in the flying training system because all of the new airplanes coming into the front line, the Buccaneer, Phantom, Harrier, were reckoned to be a bit advanced to fly straight from the NAT, so the good idea was to put everybody through a Hunter course, and of course there was only one Hunter ACU, and so there was a great blockage in the system. I went off for a year, most of which I spent as a platoon commander in an Army Scottish Infantry battalion, and then came back for a bit of refresher flying after about a year off, and then down to Chivenor for the Hunter.
So what was a Hunter like to fly?
Very nice. I mean, it was a wonderful aeroplane, sort of modern equivalent of the Spitfire. Yeah, it's just a joy to fly, really.
And how long did you spend on the Hunter?
The course was about 4 months, I think, about 50 hours. Very much for the first time, you used the basics like instrument flying, navigation and what have you to do a job, really. It was the first applied flying we'd really done, and it was concentrating on weaponry and specifically air-to-air because the course we did was tailored to people going to the Lightning.
So you then went on to the Lightning. Could you tell us your first thoughts of the jet?
Big, powerful, frightening. But soon got used to it. It was a lovely aeroplane.
Yeah. So how much ground training did you need before you even got in the seat of one?
On the Lightning,
Yes.
Quite an extended technical ground school, a lot of simulator flying, and so you felt you knew the aeroplane quite well by the time you actually climbed into it.
Can you remember your first reheat takeoff?
Vaguely. I think I left my brains on the end of the runway when I started and picked them up again on the way back. It was, yes.
Pretty good, yeah.
Attention getting.
So what squadrons were you based with on the Lightning?
29 first on the F3 at Wattisham, and then 92 with the F2A at Goodisloe.
So what was the role of the Lightning at this time?
In the UK at 29, it was really point defence. It was the F3 had the big engines and the small ventral tank, very much the racing car, a sports model, and very short range. Standard sortie was about 50 minutes, and most of that was transiting out to the North Sea, and it was really air defence of the UK.
Yeah.
The Germany was defence of the central region. We did some medium level stuff, but a lot of it was low level, so quite different role.
Was the Lightning suited for this role?
As suited as anything else. It lacked fuel, it lacked a really good radar, and it lacked missiles. We only carried 2 missiles, and on the F-2A, those were rear hemisphere only missiles, fire streak. The F-3 carried a red top, which had a very limited head-on capability against supersonic targets.
Yeah.
But it was manoeuvrable. It could stand up for itself in a fight.
So how many hours did you get on Lightning?
About 1,200.
Not bad. Yeah. Then you moved on to the Phantom. Could you tell us about this?
My choice really. When the Lightning Force was shutting up shop in Germany and the air defence role there being taken over by the F4, it was a straight choice really between going to the F4 in the air defence role or to Binbrook. And I thought it was time for a change, so I opted for the F4 and was lucky enough to get it. Went to Coningsby to do the OCU there, and then down to Watersham again on 56 Squadron.
So was the Phantom this time, your role, was it all air-to-air?
Yeah.
All air-to-air?
Yeah, it was intercept, but very much more capable than the Lightning really. Good performance, especially with the Spey engines in it. Very good radar, a pulse Doppler radar, lots of missiles, 4 AIM-9s and 4 AIM-7 Sparrows.
Could you tell the difference in performance compared to the Lightning?
It probably wasn't quite such a pure aeroplane as the Lightning in terms of aerodynamics. The Lightning, even though 60-degree sweep wing was very predictable aeroplane, the F4 had a few little vices in the hard wing version like adverse yaw, but essentially if you played the game with it, it was extremely powerful, extremely capable. The Spey engines which we put into the F4, very powerful at low level, just a bit temperamental at high level, being a bypass engine.
Yeah. Did it take some getting used to having a backseater?
It took a bit of getting used to, but it was terrific. I enjoyed it because the F4 systems were not sensor fused as you know them now, and you really needed 2 people working in close harmony to get the best out of the airplane.
Yeah.
So it was very enjoyable from that point of view.
How did the cockpit differ to the Lightning?
Bigger. The Lightning was a very small office indeed. The front cockpit of the F4, you didn't have any controls for the radar. They were all in the back, but you did have a repeater so that you could see what the guy in the back was doing with the radar set. And yes, just roomier, but still an analog cockpit. And a HUD really only for weapon aiming, not for the HUD as we know it.
Yeah. So how many hours on F4 did you get and did you enjoy it?
Between the RAF, I can't remember how many in the UK. I suppose I would have had about 800 in the UK and another 400 in the States.
Okay. So, talking about the States, something in 1979, something special happened. Could you tell us about this?
Yeah, I was selected for the RAF USAF exchange scheme and posted eventually to MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, punishment posting. The selection was a bit odd in that the Americans, one of the differences between the 2 philosophies is the Americans always regard aircraft type as being more important than aircraft role, whereas we believe the opposite. And when the F4 in the UK was transferring from the GA role to the AD role, the Americans wanted an F4 pilot, but their F4s were being used multi-role. So the RAF asked them whether they wanted a ground attack pilot, non-Phantom qualified, or a Phantom qualified AD guy, and that's what they went to, and that's me.
Yeah. So did you feel welcome when you moved over?
Yeah, very. Yeah, so first went to Luke Air Force Base to do the IP upgrade there. There was a British exchange officer on the squadron that was doing the IP upgrade, John Walmsley, and John and I had served together on 56 previously, so he helped to ease the transition.
So what was the F4C like to fly?
Very nice. I mean, it was a hard wing F4, just like the M model that we've been flying, the FGR2, so no leading edge slats. J79 engines as opposed to the Spays, which were axial flow, very much sort of like the Avon in the Lightning. Not as powerful, the F4C. Most of them still full of dust from Vietnam, but a nice aeroplane.
Yeah. So how much ground training did you have to have?
There was a ground school there. Mostly for me, it was familiarisation with the USAF way of doing things, which most of my fellows on the course already knew. But most of them were converting to the aeroplane, many from the F-100. So really, it was the ground school was what you needed and tailored to you.
So what was the difference between European flying and UK flying to US flying?
Certainly where we started off, very good weather in the US, so not a whole lot of flying in dank weather, but very procedural. And the airspace was free, but the philosophy was do everything procedurally, and that was the hardest thing to get used to.
Yeah. So how long did you spend at Luke?
About 4 months.
4 months.
Yeah.
Then you went on to MacDill to fly as the F4D.
Yes.
What was the difference between that and the C?
Very little, really. It had some avionic upgrades in as far as you could call them avionics, but essentially it was the same aeroplane, same engines, same missile capability, a few tweaks to the radar, but nothing significant.
So how often would you fly?
Most days. Yeah, just about every day on average. The sortie cycle in USAF training is extremely long. So if you fly 2 sorties in a day, it's a long day.
Yeah.
So mostly once, but we did get a lot of flying.
Yeah. Do you have any memorable stories from Luke or MacDill?
Well, the one that stands out in my mind was acting as an instructor on the air-to-ground range in the back seat with a student in the front who rejoiced in the name of a Lieutenant Stephen D. Funkhauser. We were doing 10-degree low-angle bombing, which is a profile that is essentially quite hazardous in that for the latter part of the profile you are well outside the seat limits because you're close to the ground and descending at quite a rate, and it's very easy to get target fixation on that particular profile, and I don't think I was quite quick enough with the back stick, and I'm told by the ranger who was sat watching us in the tower that we emptied most of the sand out of the bombing circle on the recovery, so quite exciting enough.
So overall, did you enjoy your time flying the American F4s?
Yes, I did. Yeah, it was great fun. MacDill was a lovely place. Socially, it was terrific. The guys were good. A lot of ex-Vietnam vets. My flight commander was a particularly celebrated one, and yeah, a great experience.
So in 1980, something happened to you as well. You went on to fly the F-16. How did this come about?
Well, when we were at Luke, we were very disappointed to find out that MacDill was losing its F-4Es to be swapped out with the D models at Homestead Air Force Base down in Miami. The 2 units were replacement training units, what we'd know as OCUs for the F-4. We figured out after we got there that the reason for this was that the wing at MacDill, 56 TAC fighter wing, was the first one slated to convert to the F-16 after the original wing at Hill in Utah. So really from the time that I got there on the F-4, the prospect of the wing converting was uppermost in everybody's minds, really. There were some people who, by virtue of the time left to serve, were not going to qualify for the F-16. There were also a lot of people parachuted in from outside to join the wing. But the long-term plan was that 3 of the 4 F-4 squadrons at MacDill were going to convert, and the 4th one was going to remain as an F-4 squadron until it finally folded. So I set about persuading my wing commander that even though I was a bit of a liability, I was at least a known liability, and I really ought to convert to the F-16, and eventually I bought him enough beer, and there I was in.
Brilliant. So how much ground school did you need?
Everything really in the training setup there was in its infancy. We had no simulator. The ground school had been devised by General Dynamics and was mostly computer based, which was the first time we'd really operated with that. We did go out to Williams Air Force Base in Phoenix because a research setup there had made a mock-up of an F-16 with a HUD and what have you, and that was really the closest we were going to get. So it was, again, fortunately I didn't have to learn USAF procedures and the local area at MacDill. It was only the aeroplane that I had to get used to.
So going back a bit, what were your first thoughts of the F-16?
Awesome. I think the aeroplane at that time, it was still General Dynamics. It was the product of the light fighter fly-off between the YF-16 and the YF-17. The YF-17 later, in a much larger version, became the F-18. But the F-16, which won the competition, entered service essentially pretty much like the YF-16 had been. And it was built around a revolutionary fly-by-wire system, which allowed better performance through relaxed static stability. I did talk to some fairly senior gentlemen at GD who were of the opinion that if the company had known at the time what a massive order was going to be the product of it, they would never have dared to come up with such a revolutionary system. But it was definitely the making of the aeroplane.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So what were your first thoughts of the side controller stick?
Very easy to get used to. We had block 5s mostly when we first started out. The block 1 was a sort of early production model, but those and the block 5s had a very solid side controller stick. There was no movement in it at all. It was all force transducers to tell the system what you wanted it to do.
Yeah.
And that was very twitchy and notchy, especially in roll and especially in close formation. But going back to the way that the aeroplane was brought into service, because GD had used their own money for it, they were able to liaise with the customer, the user, and improve the airplane on a rolling basis without Pentagon interference. And so one of the first feedbacks we gave them was, hey, this stick's too twitchy. We need something with just a bit of movement in it. That, through normal military channels, would have taken a decade. They were back with it inside 3 weeks, and fitted the moving side stick, and it was a transformation.
So Dim, could you tell us about your first trip in an F-16?
The trips were very close hold early on, and only people who were selected for the course were allowed to fly in the aeroplane at the time. So once I was selected, I had a trip with one of the IPs who'd already converted at Hill. I think we went off and did some DACT with F4s, and it was just a revelation. The F4 particularly, most of my time had been spent in the back seat, where you were sort of in a dimly lit greenhouse with a load of ironmongery between you and the outside world. Every time you found a hole to look through, they'd fill it with some instrument or other. And it was not a terribly nice work environment. The F-16, you just sat on top of the world in a one-piece canopy, and you could see everything. The airplane would do whatever you wanted it to do. Just awesome.
So could you tell us what your role was on the squadron? Okay,
as I said before, the wing was one of the F4 RTUs when I went there, and subsequently became the F-16 RTU until they opened up Luke in that role as well. And we were basically taking people from the front line on other airplanes, from pilot training, and also the odd guy that was coming to recheck out in the airplane again, and we took them through a variety of courses to go out to the front line. We also trained our own IPs, so we had a variety of courses that we were doing there.
So did you practice much air to ground?
Yeah, the airplane was bought, even though it was really an air superiority fighter and too small to be a ground attack airplane, everybody thought. The way they got the money out of the budget was by casting it as an F-4 replacement. And the F-4's primary role in the USAF at the time was ground attack. And so that's what the F-16 had to persuade everybody it was capable of doing, and it certainly was.
Yeah. So how did you find the air-to-ground role?
It was the avionics of the airplane just made it easy. In the visual role, instead of fixed site bombing, which you'd had in the F4, you had two main modes of release. One was CCIP, and constantly computing impact point, and the other one was CCRP, release point. And you either pointed the airplane in the right direction, had a bomb fall line which you dragged through the target, and when the pipper at the end of it got to the target, you pickled it off. CCRP, you just designated the target and then pulled, and when the computer thought the time was right, off came the bomb. And even a novice could get a 10-meter accuracy very early on, so it was just a revelation.
Yeah. Could you tell us some stories, if you have them, about DACT in the F-16?
Yeah, we, being a training unit, we didn't really have a lot of time to go and do extraneous stuff, but we did a little bit. We flew DACT against the F-4s of our own wing until they were phased out. We also went up to Langley and did some combat against the F-15, and it was the F-15 really that we mostly fought against. How did it fare against the F-15? The early F-16 had no radar missile. Okay, it only had a variety of AIM-9s, the Papa, Juliet, and eventually the Lima, which had a head-on capability. So the F-15 was at a great advantage at long range, and it had the AIM-7 missile. The trick was, by whatever nefarious means, to live till the merge, and we had a variety of tactics. Yeah. If you could do that, then it was a knife fight in a telephone box, and the F-15 we referred to as a flying tennis court, because once you got the sight on it, you couldn't get it off. Yeah. And because of the aerodynamic, particularly the limiting flight controls, so you got maximum G when you needed it, you got maximum AOA when you needed it, no chance of overstressing, and you could just throw the airplane around. Could it sustain a 9G turn? Certainly could. The pilot couldn't. But the aircraft could. But the aircraft could. Yeah. So could you describe the cockpit to us? Yes, it was, by today's standards, Stone Age. It was wonderful at the time. You sat in this 30-degree reclined seat, although you did put your head to the vertical, so you flew with a slight head nod the whole time. Otherwise, your senses would have been thrown out of kilter. So the seat was very comfortable. The sitting position with a side stick controller was just what you needed. Yeah. Really, it was very easy to get used to. We had an elbow rest there for holding your right arm steady against the side stick under high G, but really most of the time we didn't use it. In terms of instruments, it was still pretty much an analog cockpit. Okay, round dials. The HUD was extremely good, and in fact the HUD, because it was so much better than the head-down instruments, was the primary flight instrument display, unlike most of our airplanes where you use the HUD all the time, but when the chips are down, the primary display is the round dials. Yeah. It had a little radar set where the stick would normally be, so you looked straight down into the radar set 90 degrees off, and it was very easy to read, computerized radar presentation, and it had a stores management set, which was a sort of little MFD, but hard keys only, unlike the touch screens of today. what else on the cockpit? Hands-on throttle and stick. There were some radar controls on a panel, but mostly once you'd got that set up, you could fight the airplane with the switches on the throttle and stick, and that was pretty revolutionary.
Yeah. So, could you tell us the difference between the A and the B model?
The A model was single seat. B model was two-seater. Very similar. Because of the shape of the airplane, the view out of the back cockpit was not terrific, but you had a repeater where your radar scope was you could make into a TV screen of the view out the front from the front cockpit, so you could actually land looking at this television screen, which showed the front cockpit HUD. It was, yes, it was a trainer designed purely for that.
Yeah. So, how was it coming from like a twin-engine aircraft to a single-engine?
I don't think we ever noticed. I mean, the single engine in the F-16 gave it more performance than the twin engines in either of the other fighters I'd flown.
Yeah.
So it was comfortably over 1.1, 1-to-1 powder weight ratio on takeoff. The subsequent engines were uprated, but by the same token, the all-up mass of the airplane went ballistic as they added new kit to it. So essentially, the performance of the F-16 then in the early days was pretty much, I think, like it is now.
So the engine was very reliable?
Yes, it was a Pratt & Whitney 100 engine, and it had powered the F-15, and the F-15 had a lot of trouble with it, I think, in the early days, but they had two of them. And so with constant modification, the engine became extremely reliable, which of course we were very glad about. In fact, it was so reliable that until my successor, who'd come from Chivener, arrived at MacDill, they had no means of landing the airplane engine off.
Really?
Well, they thought they could do it, but they had no procedure.
Yeah.
And they thought the engine was so reliable, quite rightly, that it wasn't worth hazarding, and therefore if the engine stopped, you jumped over the side.
Yeah.
John arrived and showed that with very little risk, you could get an airplane back on the ground, and that procedure was adopted by them.
Yeah. So did you ever conduct air-to-air refueling?
Yes. AAR had been a part of our life really since the Lightning days. The Lightning really needed it because it had no fuel to endure. The F4 did it to extend time on cap. Going to the States, of course, we went from probe and drogue in UK to the boom and receptacle, so that was a little bit to learn, and in fact the first time I practiced that I was in the back seat of an F4. We did the tanking trials on the KC-10 for the F-16 from MacDill, and really it was just a different technique to achieve the same end.
Yeah. So how many aircraft were based at the squadron?
I recall that on the squadron, a little over 20, I think. I recall that we had about 90 aircraft on the wing between the four squadrons. So a lot of ironmongery and very high priced.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about the weapon loads it could carry?
Yeah, mostly because we were a training unit, we dealt in the basics. And indeed, not that many weapons had been cleared for the F-16 at that time. Mostly it was practice bombs, and there were two types, BDU-33, which represented a low drag weapon, a slick bomb, and the Mark 107, I think it was called, which represented a high drag bomb. We could also carry a variety of dumb weapons, Mark 82s, 500 pounder, 83s, 1,000 pounder, and occasionally, although I never did it, Mark 84, which is a 2,000 pounder. We also had Maverick. Air-to-air wise, we just had the AIM-9s.
So, was there a difference the way...
Oh, and the gun, sorry.
The gun.
20 mil integral Gatling gun,
Just the
fantastic. Just the one is all you need.
Yeah. So, was there any differences between the way the US Air Force conducted briefs and debriefs?
Yes, again, pretty procedural. I shudder to recall now that when I went to my first Lightning Squadron, we started the brief half an hour before takeoff. So the brief was 10 minutes, or maybe 8 if you had to go and get your kit on, and then 20 minutes from walk to get airborne. In the USAF it was 2 hours. An hour of that was briefing. And again, remember, it was a student environment, so everything had to be covered. And then really it was a fairly leisurely stroll to get airborne, and the airfield was big, so you had a lot of taxiing to do, and then last chance checks. So yes, it was a different tempo altogether.
Could you tell us how it compared to the Lightning and the Phantom?
Performance-wise, very, very agile, much more agile than either of those two. Avionically, a different generation, just no comparison at all. And the big thing about the F-16 really was the flight control computer system, which allowed you completely carefree handling, which we'd practiced in the Lightning principally because we didn't have any instruments to tell us we were doing things that we shouldn't be. And the F4 was a big aeroplane that you had to treat with respect.
Yeah. So, do you have any memorable stories from your time on the F-16?
Yeah, a lot, but I think the highlight of the tour was Operation Coronet West. The US had been selling F-16s from very early days to a lot of other nations, and of course we were required to ferry them to wherever they were going. I put in my request to do this very early on, but I think the State Department turned it down because they didn't want a Brit flying a US airplane into a third nation. Even when they started delivering to the Israelis, and I pointed out to the wing commander that I was his only instructor who didn't require a visa to enter Israel, it cut no ice either. So eventually time came for the 8th TAC Fighter Wing at Kunsan in Korea, a USAF outfit, to get their first F-16s, and my name came out of the hat. So we picked up the airplanes out of Fort Worth, Carswell, with about 2.5 hours, I think 3 hours on the airplane. Flew it to Hickam, Hawaii, on the first leg, and that was about 8 hours, I think, with air refueling support. The INS was so accurate that by the time I got to Hawaii, I had to manually ACL the target marker off the end of the runway because it was about 10 feet from where it should have been, and was getting in my way. From Hawaii we went to Guam, to Anderson Air Force Base, which is very much in the news at the moment, and from there to Kadena, Okinawa, and then a short hop into Korea. Wow. Well, there were 8 of us, I think, 7 maybe, yes, 7. And 2 of us noticed that the other 5 were getting progressively less and less happy as we went along, and we realized the reason was that we were the only 2 that were going back to Florida, and the others were staying for a year in Korea.
So how many years did you stay in America, and did you enjoy your time over there?
Oh yeah, it was 3.5 years total. When I converted the F-16, part of the deal was that I extended my tour so that I would return the training service. My letter of complaint to Mrs. Thatcher got lost in the mail somewhere. So yes, and people were sticking pins in my effigy, those who timed their posting to coincide with hopefully taking over from me. But no, it was marvellous.
Brilliant stuff. Tim, could you tell us what happened when you returned to the UK?
Yeah, I'd done a bit of groundwork. I could see that the Air Force in its wisdom were angling to sling me back in the QRA shed on the F4, and I thought that with the new experience I'd had, that I'd be more value and have more fun somewhere else. So much as I had loved the F4, I asked them if I could switch to a ground attack role, and was fortunate enough to get a flight commander slot on the Jaguar force.
So when did your training begin on the Jaguar?
As soon as I came back, really, about a month after we came back, July '82, and I went up to Lossy for the Jaguar course there.
Mm-hmm. So what are your initial thoughts of the Jaguar coming from the F-16?
Just totally different. I mean, the airframe was quite primitive by comparison. The avionics mostly, but there were some good bits of the Jaguar. We had a moving map, which the F-16 had never had, and it was a thoroughly likeable airplane.
Mm-hmm. So what squadrons were you based with, and what was your role?
Our role was essentially ground attack, close air support, a lot of battlefield air interdiction and air interdiction. It was a low-level role. I was on 54 Squadron at Caldershall, wonderful base north of Norwich, now sadly no longer used. And our war deployment was to Tierstrup in Denmark, and we were part of the Comair BOLTAP, Baltic Air Command. Our task really was to provide some offensive counter-air against the Warsaw Pact airfields and radar installations in order to give the rest of the Air Force a bit of a breathing space.
So what was it actually like to fly?
Very nice. It was a lovely low-level platform. It was extremely underpowered. The adage that it relied heavily on the curvature of the Earth to get airborne was no exaggeration. It did, especially when heavily loaded. It had very limited maneuverability. It was very hard to see, so our main tactic essentially was to run away and hide.
Yeah. Did you ever fly on any large exercises?
Yes, I did red flags with the Jaguar. I'd done one on the F-16. And maple flag, and also we had a lot of large exercises, tactical fighter meets and bombing competitions and what have you in the UK.
So how did the other nations at these big exercises view the Jaguar?
I think they viewed it as quite a formidable little airplane. It was, as I say, very hard to see. We flew very low, much lower than the Americans normally fly. For red flag, we were down at 100 feet, and that really was as close to 100 feet as we could get. It had by that time, a reasonable radar warning receiver. And we had some good tactics and a little ECM pod and some chaff and flares, so we could give a good account of ourselves with the surface threats. But really, if we were spotted by an F-16 or an F-15, things got quite hard.
Yeah. So how many hours did you get on the Jaguar?
About 1,800.
Yeah. What happened after you flew the Jaguar? You went on to the Hawk?
Yes, I went to do my obligatory tour in MOD, which stretched itself into 2 tours in MOD, and then I was lucky enough to be posted as station commander at Valley, which is our advanced flying training base in Anglesey. I had only flown the Hawk about 10 or 20 hours before, and so I had to go and get really familiar with the airplane and also learn to be an instructor.
So when did your RAF career finish?
My regular RAF career finished in 2003, but I had been fortunate enough to find out quite by accident, because my last tour was in Saudi Arabia, a bit out of the way in terms of communications, but I had learned about this wonderful scheme called full-time reserve service, which allowed you to go back and be a flight lieutenant again and try and prove you were a better one the second time round. Really take your pick of the jobs that were available and fill a frontline slot that could not be filled by anybody else, or a slot from the front line is a more accurate term, that would be filled by somebody that they couldn't spare from the front line. So I went to Leeming and I spent 6.5 very happy years on the Hawk as a qualified pilot nav instructor, teaching baby navs for the Tornado GR1 and the F3 to operate a 2-place fast jet airplane. Wonderful.
So do you still work in aviation currently?
Loosely speaking, yes, through two things that I do. One is that I'm the Europe editor of a military simulation and training magazine. So that helps me get out from under the wife's feet and keep in touch with a lot of old friends and make some new ones. And also I've been involved for the last 6 or 7 years with a charity book called Out of the Blue, which raises funds for the RAF Benevolent Fund and other charities. So again, that's kept me in touch with aviation.
Brilliant. So I'm going to ask you a few personal questions now, Dim. So
Yeah.
do you have any hobbies?
Yeah, apart from those two things, the obligatory bit of music, bit of cycling, bit of gardening, and woodwork. So,
Do you ever get to air shows?
I have to confess that I'm now no longer really an airshow person, mostly because I don't particularly like crowds, not because I don't particularly like airplanes, but also the work that I've done for the magazine and through other commitments has meant that I've been to a few air shows, and I don't have great ambitions to go to too many more.
No. What's your favourite aircraft you've flown?
I suppose it's got to be the F-16, although, you know, all of them have a place in my heart. The Lightning is the first one, the F4 is extremely capable, and the Jaguar as an honest and totally enjoyable aeroplane. And that had something to do with Coldershall as a place, and the Coldershall wing as an outfit, but it was just a very happy place to be and a wonderful role.
Yeah. Is there an aircraft you wish you could have flown?
I've had a little go in a Typhoon,
Very nice.
and yes, I wish I'd been around long enough. I think they thought 61 was old enough to be flying fast jets anyway, so any volunteering for the Typhoon force was likely to fall on deaf ears. But yeah, a lovely aeroplane, and I would have loved to have flown it.
And finally, do you ever get sick of talking about aviation?
No.